and that you're able to see the presenter slideshow. Perfect. Well, my name is Sophia Shrestha. I'm a clinical pharmacist by training, and currently I am the clinical pharmacist for our advanced therapies program at mHealth Fairview, working primarily with our lysosomal storage disorder patients as well as PKU patients. And today I just wanted to give you a little background on our clinic's process, but also just an overview on medication access, specifically looking at prior authorization as a utilization management strategy that's implemented by health plans and pharmacy benefit plans. My goals are to first provide an overview of or utilization management strategies that are implemented, discuss some of the advantages and disadvantages of using prior authorization as a strategy, since it is a very common strategy that is used, review the landscape, particularly as it relates to rare disease and orphan drugs that we've seen in development, and then also look at what strategies that are available currently to alleviate burden of PAs on our providers. And lastly, describe specifically our clinic's experience and how we navigate and kind of overcome our prior authorization challenges. So utilization management is a strategy that's implemented by all health plans and pharmacy benefit management companies. And the primary goal is for them to evaluate efficiency, appropriateness, as well as medical necessity of any services that are provided to patients. These could be procedures, treatments, medications, you name it. There will be a utilization management strategy kind of stuck to that treatment for our patients. And when we're looking at medication utilization management strategies, there are three primary ones that are used kind of across all health and insurance plans. The first one is called step therapy, which is where the insurance or health plan will require kind of a trial and error. So trial of something that's a bit more lower cost, but proven to be clinically effective therapy as first line before they step up to perhaps a more expensive or costly therapy. Secondly, will be quantity limits. And we often see this with, I would say most common is opiate medications and controlled substances, where the goal is to control waste and avoid overuse of medications that might be a safety hazard to patient, and that's just controlling how much medication could be dispensed at one time. What we see most often with specialty and rare disease medications is need for prior authorizations. So for an insurance plan to cover the medication, it first needs to be approved, and several documentations might need to be submitted before a payment is made on that service or treatment. Some other newer strategies that we've seen with our specialty and rare disease space is site of care policies that are tacked on with prior authorization. And these are policies in place which dictate the physical choice of where a medication can be administered. Typically, we see these with infusions where a lower cost site of service is required. So rather than a hospital-based infusion center, a patient might be directed to use a provider's office or home infusion. Looking specifically at prior authorization, as I mentioned, it's used by all health and prescription plans. And that's to, again, ensure that the therapy the patient's receiving is necessary, effective, and cost efficient. I will say a patient can always pay cash for their treatments, but that is never feasible, especially for our high cost specialty and rare disease medications. So prior authorization is a step that we have to go through when we want to start a patient on all of these new therapies. Typically, first step is the verification of coverage. So looking at the formulary and making sure that if a PA is needed, what those PA criteria look like. It could be that they prefer a certain brand medication or certain indications are the only ones covered. Then collecting the patient's clinical information from their chart and submitting it as a need for medical necessity along with the PA request. Then you'll hear back on the determination as step 3 if it's approved or not. If denied, the cycle kind of continues and we go through multiple appeal processes. If a PA is denied, the care team has to be given an appeal option by a health plan. Typically, there are multiple levels of appeal. We could have an expedited appeal where you can submit additional clinical information, letters of medical necessities, and publications to support the use of the treatment. We might have peer-to-peer discussion between the prescriber and the health plans provider. And with the peer-to-peer, one thing to note is that the health plans provider will not necessarily be an expert or a specialist in the treatment that they are approving. And lastly, with current laws with healthcare, all health plans must also provide an option for an external appeal if they continue to have continued denies on the PA, where a third party not related to the health plan will review the request. So with all these steps in prior authorizations, their primary goal is to minimize drug spend, so reducing the overall cost of care for our patients. And oftentimes this it can be achieved from a simple switch, such as going from a brand name to a therapeutically equivalent generic. So that's a very easy PA criteria that they can place where they require a generic use. Or with more specialty therapies, you might have heard of biosimilars. So a lot of our products now are biologics that are approved. Switching from that reference original product to a biosimilar, if it's approved, is another way to minimize drug spend, since they are clinically safe, equivalent as far as safety and efficacy. And also minimizing drug spend in that we are making sure that these high-cost therapies are dispensed to the correct patient groups, and we're not overutilizing our healthcare either. The second advantage of using prior authorizations is that it really ensures that the therapy that's being dispensed is clinically evidence-based and appropriate. So using it for FDA-approved indications or for therapies that have peer-reviewed publications that support its use. Again, given the high cost of these therapies, these also help manage drug spend and make sure that the correct drug is going to the correct patient. And lastly, it does promote safe drug use as well. As I had mentioned, a lot of the utilization management strategies around high-risk medications, including opiates, so a lot of them will require prior authorizations just to identify if there is any duplicative therapies that the patient might already be on. It also ensures that medications that are high risk and may have something called a REMS program. So certain medications are, when they're approved, have a risk evaluation and mitigation strategy that the FDA requires on those products. It just makes sure that those requirements are being met. If there are certain labs that are needed before a patient starts on therapy, PAs also ensure that those are being addressed prior to starting the therapy. Even with these advantages, what we often run into is that there are several disadvantages as well, primarily being that it is a very manual and time-consuming process, which at this time really takes away resources from direct patient care for our providers, which leads to treatment delays as you're waiting for back and forth with these appeals. Sometimes it can take several months, sometimes up to a year before you get an approval, which can cause significant delay and negatively impact patient outcomes. And another thing about PAs is that you do have to get a prior authorization annually. So even if you get an initial approval, you do have to submit for a renewal every year. And it's possible that the criteria for renewals are different from the initial PA. So demonstrating to the health plan that the patient is benefiting from the therapy with these renewals are pretty common. And lastly, it's a very complicated process since each health plan and prescription plan kind of has their own policies as well as formularies and guidelines. So just because one health plan approved a therapy does not mean that another will. Looking into the rare disease space then, as we're all aware, there are over 7,000 rare diseases identified. And with the Orphan Drug Act of 1983, we've really seen quite a big approval rate for our orphan drugs. We've seen a lot of commercial companies are now incentivized to develop these therapies. In 2020, over half of the novel drugs that were approved were for a rare or orphan disease indication. And it's expected that the drug pipeline looking ahead at the next couple of years, about a third of them are also for orphan drugs. There's still a lot of research and need in this area, but it is exciting to see that there's a lot of drug development going on there as well. And these therapies typically include both specialty therapies, so a lot of biologic products that are used chronically, weekly, every other week, possibly daily, to one-time treatments such as gene therapies are also in the horizon. What's important to note about orphan drugs or rare disease therapies is that the cost is often significantly higher than your traditional non-orphan drug. I put down here it's about 4.5 times higher, but typically it's significantly higher than that, and usually it starts at about hundreds of thousands of dollars per year of treatment, which is why prior authorizations and other utilization management strategies is such a high point for a lot of health plans, because they really want to find a strategy that gets the right therapy to the patient but also controls costs at the same time. And with the global market right now, it's expected to reach over 400 billion for rare disease by 2032. So this will be a big area of focus for a lot of health plans coming up here. As mentioned, given the high cost, we will continue to see the use of utilization management and benefit strategies on both the pharmacy and medical benefits side. So certain medications, typically orals, injectables, are only approved through a pharmacy benefit, whereas certain treatments, gene therapies, infusions might only be covered under the medical benefit. But both of them will utilize a prior authorization process. We'll also see site of care policies being implemented. We've seen a big rise in that recently as well, but it will really be restricting patients to lower cost site of service. So these would be home infusion and provider's office. And we'll see less of infusion centers and hospital-based infusions. And using prior authorizations, again, is going to be a big thing. So making sure that the patient is receiving the therapy for the FDA indicated diagnosis. They will require that specific molecular diagnostic tests are submitted with the initial PA, including baseline labs. And more recently, we've seen that the authorizing or ordering provider also must be the specialist in that field. So whether it's a hematologist or a geneticist, they do require that the prescription come from a specialist, just again, to make sure that the correct patient's getting the therapy. Right now, these are kind of the focuses for utilization management, but in the future, as we see more of these higher cost therapies, gene therapies, focus is going to move more towards value-based care, where patient reimbursement and payment is going to be more dependent on the outcomes themselves. So looking at adherence rates, clinical outcomes, ER visits, hospitalizations to determine if a payment is going to be made or not. With all of that in mind, there are certain steps we can take to reduce some of the burden on the care team side. A big thing is checking prior authorization requirements before sending prescriptions to the pharmacy. Most formularies and policies are available through the payers, and they should be made available. Providers that use electronic medical records are notified if a PA is required at the point of prescribing. So that's a good flag to know maybe there is a generic or a PA triage tree, kind of to see what their PA requirements are before sending that prescription. There are also generics that are going to be available. It's not as common with a lot of our specialty therapies, but prescribing generics whenever possible. So just making sure that the dispense as written codes are left at 0, which means the pharmacy can dispense a generic. If there's a generic available and a brand is prescribed, more than likely you will run into an PA issue. Another big thing is documentation and making sure all information is submitted with that initial PA request. So this will really help avoid any delays with back and forth with insurance when you're trying to get a PA approval. If you have documentation of the patient's care plan, specifically their tried and failed therapies, what medication and medical history they have, if that is all submitted right away, it will really help speed up the approval process because oftentimes a prior authorization may say, oh, a patient needs to try X, Y, and Z before they can move on to this therapy. So having all of that documented and sent will be really helpful. A third thing that's very common and more on the rise right now is just using electronic PA submissions. This has a much quicker turnaround time, and you can submit all the necessary documentation all online. Oftentimes, you will see the determination right away when you hit that submit button. Oftentimes, you might hear about Cover My Meds. That's a big one that's used, but using electronic case submissions rather than fax will save a lot of time and just also automate the process for your clinic. And another thing I wanted to highlight was that part of reducing the PA burden is utilizing other members of the care team. It does not have to fall solely on the providers. So, utilizing medical assistants, nurse care coordinators, pharmacy technicians who are able to submit these electronic PAs or forms via fax to the health plans. They have access to the patient's medical records. They are clinically able to interpret and submit those clinical documentations and make sure that everything is sent with that initial request. Specialty pharmacists is also another group that can be utilized that I don't think a lot of clinics right now do use, and that's because the specialty pharmacists are very aware of these disease states within rare disease since they work with those patients, available pharmacotherapies, if there are generics available, if there are biosimilars available, and they're very great at navigating formularies and guidelines as well as PA requirements. Um, there is some data also. Most recently, there was an article from the specialty pharmacy in Cleveland where they had pharmacists, specialty pharmacists submit all their PAs and appeals across all specialties. And they found that across all specialties, when pharmacists were involved with the initial PA approval, it was 71%, 67 on first appeal, 27% on second appeal, and 30% on third appeal, with an average turnaround time of 8.5 days for an approval, which is pretty impressive because PA approval times can sometimes take months. So really using other clinical staff that are available to your clinic will be very beneficial to try to reduce some of that burden and increase patient care time. And the last one that's often not thought about is you can actually leverage your pharmaceutical manufacturer's medical team to reduce the PA burden as well. Several rare disease manufacturers have very specific case management teams, and for almost all of them, they will have a pretty comprehensive service, starting with benefits investigation. So they will do the benefits investigation and submit that initial PA. They will sign patients up for copay assistance programs. If a patient has a lapse in insurance or are having trouble getting PA approval, they will provide free drug or bridge them with therapy. They have regional field management specialists that will be able to kind of assist with any appeals or denials, and even have samples of medical necessities, letters that you can use and kind of tweak to your patient's needs to submit. So that's one group that I think is underutilized, which a lot of clinics, if they don't have a lot of clinical support, I would highly encourage using um, our pharma partners to be able to provide better care for our patients as well. Most often, all that's needed is a consent form from both the patient and the provider. They can initiate all of these services and continue with annual renewals and any kind of further case management or assistance that might be needed. In our clinic particularly, we do have our pharmacy support access teams that are heavily integrated into our specialty clinics. As I had mentioned, I'm part of the rare disease clinic, so my pharmacy support is focused there. But in general, what we have are clinical access teams. Um, for orals and injectables, they will, once a prescription's been entered, automatically submit the prior authorizations and clinical information. They will obtain renewals as they expire, send it to the appropriate pharmacy that's required by the insurance, and also only contact the care team if additional support is needed, letters are needed, or if a peer-to-peer is needed, which is kind of outside of their scope. On the infusion side as well, similarly, we have a group of specialized technicians and pharmacists that will initiate the benefits, submit the PA, and secure the prior authorization before a patient comes in for their first infusion. And they make sure, again, that the renewals are done in time and only reach out to the care team or the provider if there's any necessary appeals that are outside of their scope. We also utilize our clinical pharmacists quite a bit. So we do have pharmacists supporting various specialty clinics, whether that's in GI, oncology, or rare disease like myself. And we have collaborative practice agreements with the specialist to allow us to prescribe or initiate the prescription for any oral, injectable, and infused therapies. Order baseline labs if it's needed under that collaborative practice agreement, if a PA requires it. And really biggest thing is reviewing a patient's medical history and submitting all the necessary tests, writing peer-reviewed and clinically guided letters of medical necessity to submit to the insurance, which sometimes can take several hours. So really taking that burden off of the providers and submitting it on their behalf, and working very closely with our manufacturer partners to initiate patient assistance as well as the PA assistance I had mentioned, and serving as the primary contact. So if there are questions from health or prescription plans, rather than trying to reach the provider, they will go directly to our clinical pharmacist and are able to kind of resolve any issues and really speed up that prior authorization process. So PA process in our clinic, as mentioned, so if a pharmacist or a provider e-prescribes a therapy and a PA is needed, for oral and injectable, we have a separate team that will submit that PA through either the medical or pharmacy benefit. On the infusion side, similarly, they will submit the benefits and secure a prior authorization. And the clinical pharmacist is really responsible for kind of collecting all the clinical documentation that's needed for that initial submission so we can get an approval right away. If for any reason it's denied and an appeal is needed, then the pharmacist or another member of the care team will do a thorough literature review, find published articles to support the medication for the patient, write the letter, submit it as typically an urgent appeal, which has a 72-hour turnaround time, or a standard appeal, which can take up to 60 days. I always encourage providers to do an urgent appeal to hear a quicker turnaround time. If that again is denied, then we have other secondary PA appeal options, which include setting up a peer-to-peer. A downside of that is that the provider on the other side may not be the specialist in the area that you're prescribing. So education is needed in that front. And then submitting an external review, which again is third party. It's not related to the health plan, but it is required by law to be provided as an option for all patients. And if we continue to have denials, that's when we would want to really seek out patient assistance through manufacturers and foundations. One thing to note about manufacturer-related patient assistance programs for free drug is that they do require multiple denials before they can proceed with the free drug program, but it is an option if that manufacturer has that is available, because we certainly use it for a lot of our patients. So there are lots of fixing, I would say, that's needed for our current prior authorization process, primarily related to the provider burden. A survey by the AMA reported that a third of providers feel that PAs have led to an adverse event for patients in their care, with over 85% reporting that it's led to a greater use of healthcare resources. Since you are delaying care, you're diverting care to something that might be more ineffective, and you might be causing additional office visits or urgent care visits due to uncontrolled conditions. What we do know, though, is that looking ahead at the specialty and orphan drugs pipeline, we are going to see more of these drugs be approved. So more health and prescription plans will implement these stringent, probably even more stringent prior authorization strategies to just reduce total drug spend for healthcare. And I think at this time, to reduce delay in care and but also kind of reduce some of the burden for providers as they navigate these prior authorization processes, is to really consider what other resources are available from your health system, whether that's partnering with the manufacturers or really leveraging your clinic staff. I think on my end, obviously, we have a heavy pharmacy support in our clinic, so that's something that I always advocate for. But other things, just as simple as using electronic prior authorization systems, might also be a big benefit for our providers. That's kind of what I had prepared, but I'm happy to take any questions or clarifications you might have.
Sophia, this was great. It was so helpful and really gave a fabulous overview. So first of all, thank you so much. This is going to be a super useful kind of tutorial. Um, I did have a couple of questions, just kind of clarifications on some of your point. Obviously, as the Rare Disease Advisory Council, we want to think of ways we can advise and recommend for improvement. So some of your recommendations are just so helpful. I'm wondering if you can tell me, do you know, you mentioned electronic PA submissions to make the process more streamlined. Do you know who's responsible for setting these up and making them available? And then do you know, is that like the health plan would offer that option, like on a portal? And then do you, yeah, let's keep recording it. And then do you know who's, how many, if it is the case that it's the health plan that does it, do you know how many make the electronic submission available?
But currently, from my understanding, it's both. There are other third parties that will kind of sell their service as an electronic PA submission platform to health plans that is connected with them. But Cover My Meds is something that's completely separate. There are others as well that just help expedite that process and are available kind of as a standalone service. Um, and oftentimes it gets initiated at the point currently at the point of pharmacy. When the pharmacy receives a script and a PA is required, it will automatically, if they are connected with, say, Cover My Meds, that's who will send the PA request through. But you can either go that route or you could go directly to the health plan and request a prior authorization that way. But I found that electronic PA submission has been the easiest. So by the time it gets to the pharmacy, whoever they're partnering with will send a request to the provider.
Great, that's super helpful. And then kind of along those same lines of sort of more automaticity, you had mentioned that providers are notified through the EMR of a PA requirement. Is that just, were you making reference to the way you do it in the Fairview system? Because I know each healthcare system kind of has their own EMR, or would you say that's pretty universal in the EMR record?
That's a great question. The bigger electronic medical systems will have that at the point when you're prescribing. But again, we have providers from everywhere, and not all health systems have access to the bigger EMRs. So it will really depend. So it is very possible that some of the smaller ones don't have that capability or it's not built into their software. But the bigger ones should now all have it. But again, yes, yep, really depends on where the provider is practicing from.
Great, thank you. Those were kind of my big questions.
I've got a few. Sophia, excellent presentation, and thank you so much for doing this. Um, I imagine in this rare disease space, there's a fair amount of off-label prescribing that happens just because we're kind of on the, the edge of technology. Is the process, so I'm guessing those typically get denied right away. is the process similar, or is there a different path if it's a off-label prescription?
Yeah, that's a great question too. You are correct. A lot of rare diseases, obviously, the clinical trials that they're approved with to begin with have a very small population that they're studied. So a lot of data that we end up getting is from real life clinical practice. And in our clinic specifically, we run into this quite a bit where we want to try something new based on other clinics' data and practices. Oftentimes it is off label. Most often it's off label due to age or maybe a different subtype of diagnosis. In that case, the prior authorization process will still be the same, but you are correct in that there will be an automatic denial as soon as you send that prescription in. So, really being prepared with a letter of medical necessity that describes the patient's clinical course, disease background, and any kind of peer reviewed or even case reports that you're able to submit to support your rationale for that off label indication will really help with securing that approval. Typically, what from our experience, if you are able to submit primary literature along with that PA request, if you already know it's off label, you will have a better chance of having it be approved. And like I'd mentioned, there are several levels of that appeal, so you can continue pushing. But typically, yes, with off label use, it does tend to be a little bit of a longer process, just given all the denials you'll likely face.
Got it. Thank you. So you talked about REMS, and I want you to clarify 2 points related to that. The first point is if a drug has a REMS requirement, a REMS program attached to it, that is required by the FDA. That's point A. And B, REMS are on some specialty prescriptions, but not all. That'd be the second point for clarification.
Correct, yes. Based on clinical trial data or any kind of adverse effects they might have seen during the study of the drug, a product may have a REMS requirement, which might include the provider or the patient, something as simple as just acknowledging that these are the side effects that I might experience from it, or it might be that they're going to be required to always carry an EpiPen. So their requirement might be different. It will not be across all products, it'll be product specific. And it is the program itself will be implemented by the manufacturer, but it will be kind of required as a part of the FDA labeling that this particular product is going to have a REMS requirement. And these are the requirements for the provider to follow. These are the requirements for the pharmacy to dispense. And these are the requirements for the patient that they acknowledge and will enroll in this program and kind of understand the risks associated with it.
Okay, good. Thank you. Because I imagine when it gets intense, when you're working one of these and a REMS pops up, there's a lot of uh, you know, finger pointing at all the parties involved. And this is one of those, well, you can't fight City Hall. I mean, in order to get the drug on the market, the FDA said you got to go through this process. So, don't push against the process, you know, work it, understand what it is and follow the process. Okay, good. Thank you. Um, uh, Help clarify something else for me. I understand that typically this is under the topic of pharma case management, the slide you had on that. Doesn't, isn't it a common practice for drug companies to outsource that case management? And so from time to time, there's yet another party involved in this process. Do I understand that correctly? There's a term for them that since I'm retired, I can't remember.
There are patient foundations that are not related to the manufacturer that also have great patient assistance programs where they'll assist with copays, transportation costs, anything related to their therapy or their disease state. Typically with manufacturer ones, you have obviously the sales side of things, and then you have the medical team. Typically, the medical team is where the case management team sits, and they have access to patient PHI once the patient has consented to kind of accepting these services. So there's kind of both. With manufacturers, they have their own case management that's very product specific. So say a medication has a brand name that they're supporting, the case management team will be able to assist with copay and PAs for that brand name. But several years down the line, you have a generic product that's approved now. Unfortunately, the manufacturer will not be able to assist with anything related to that generic product since it's not their product. Similarly, with off-label indications or off-label use, they are not able to assist with copay assistance for anything that's off-label. So they're pretty restricted to what is in the manufacturer's guidelines per the package insert. Foundations, on the other hand, are the third parties. So patient assistance foundations, the biggest one being NORD, but also there are disease-specific ones that are able to really help take care of a patient on a more comprehensive level. So no matter what medication they're on, off-label, on-label, brand generic, and they're able to really assist and provide funding or financial assistance to patients that way. So that's kind of how they're different, but yes, good to make that distinction clear too.
Okay, good. Thank you. Because yeah, I think our provider partners and the patients, the council wishes to support has to understand sometimes there's a lot of cooks in the kitchen, and that's just the way it is. So the experience you cited with Cleveland Clinic in terms of their metrics, in terms of timing, would you put that on the high side of pretty good? I mean, I'm thinking expectations. Not all, clinic specialty pharmacy partners might have that fast of an experience. Is that a fair statement?
I would say so, yes. Not all specialty pharmacies or clinics have that capacity to dedicate time just to access and prior authorizations. Having 70% approval rate, especially for specialty medications, is pretty high, considering all the time that it takes, especially having it only take 8 days to get an approval is also very high. Just because with electronic PAs, it would just sped things up quite a bit, but we do not hear back on PAs right away. It can take several weeks, oftentimes months, for that appeal, especially. So I would say that the numbers that they provided are pretty high. I don't know our specialty pharmacists, our numbers to compare to, but having over 70% approval rate is pretty high for specialty therapies.
Okay, good. Well, you answered my next question is, do we, and you and I work for the same company, at least I will until the end of September. We don't track that specifically, but I would say we're close, but probably not as quick on the turnaround. Is that a fair statement?
I would have to defer on that just to see because we
Okay,
made a few changes with our on the specialty pharmacy side with therapy management, really closely following patients in addition to our clinic pharmacists, since we are so well supported on the pharmacy side, that I think now that we have clinic liaisons integrated into all of these clinics that are able to submit prior authorizations the moment initially that the prescription is sent out, I think our approval rates are probably very high as well. I know we are
okay.
currently working on tracking that as far
Oh,
as
good.
outcomes. So hopefully we'll
Yeah,
have more data soon. But I think
sure.
there is quite a big value of having pharmacy support in clinics just to help expedite this process.
Absolutely. So, yeah, so it's already being worked on. Now that I don't have to like find the funding to put a measurement process in place, I can say, well, you guys should measure that, but you're already on that. Um, you've given a lot of good advice to providers in your presentation on how to work the process, and the takeaways I got was um, understand what the process is and work the process versus, hey, let's just throw this out there and see if it gets under the radar and we get lucky, which what I'm hearing from you and experience that I've had at Fairview, it doesn't work that way. Just work the process. If you know you're going to need clinical documentation, if you know there's a PA, just start that process, because what that does is compresses the cycle time of getting an eventual approval. Is that a fair takeaway advice?
Yeah, I would agree with you on that. I think prior authorizations and utilization management strategy is certainly a challenge for clinics and providers everywhere, just because of the delay in treatment that we see with it, especially with new therapies. The rules are becoming more and more stringent, especially with newer therapies now requiring that a specialist in that area write the prescription, which might not be feasible for patients that live in rural areas, or they have a possibly not a geneticist that they're following closely, or whichever specialist it may be. So I think be able to navigate that is just having a better understanding of what that process looks like as a prior authorization and utilization management strategy, and how your clinic can kind of do some of these things, such as utilizing or leveraging your staff to pull all the clinicals that are needed, review the prior authorization guidelines prior to submission, um, reviewing the formulary, again, just doing that a little bit of an extra work ahead of time just to avoid that delay and back and forth once a PA is submitted and you get these denials. So I think I would completely agree with you, is just having better education and working through that process to make sure that your clinic can help manage and secure those PAs and get drugs to patients.
Okay, good. Thank you. The final point I want you to react to is, and you can't take the marketing out of the boy. I'm sorry. I realize with specialty pharmacy prescriptions, especially in the rare disease space, you frequently don't have a choice of the specialty pharmacies that you have to work with. And I'm talking about providers and patients. So I think a takeaway bit of advice is make sure, and the burden really falls on the provider as well as the patient and the family. Make sure you understand what resources the specialty pharmacy you're working with has available and what steps of the process they do, or versus what they expect you to do or pharma to do, so that you go into it eyes wide open. It'd be a wonderful world if you could pick the specialty pharmacy that you trust all the time, but in lieu, make sure you understand what capabilities they have and what they're willing to do for you in the process, so that as the provider or the patient or the family, you can fill in the gaps, if any. Is that a fair statement?
Yep. Again, I would definitely agree with you. Completely right in that the insurance or pharmacy the health plan will dictate what pharmacy a patient can fill at, especially for specialty pharmacies. There are preferred ones, and that's because a lot of pharmacy benefit management companies now have their own specialty pharmacies. So they want to, of course, have them be the preferred pharmacy that will fill that prescription. And as Dick mentioned, each pharmacy also has different services that they can provide. So some of the bigger ones that are very specialized in specialty therapies will have a dedicated team of, again, financial specialists that can help the provider or the clinic submit those PAs and work through those denials with them. They have comprehensive services for patient education and care that the pharmacy can provide. But again, very much dictated by the health plan, which pharmacy can fill it. I will also say more recently, what we've been seeing is that a manufacturer will only contract with one pharmacy that they will be allowing to dispense their medication. So, which again restricts access for the patient, but just understanding some of these other little nuances that are associated with accessing the medication itself, and definitely education on providers and patients' part to really make sure they know what services are provided by their specialty pharmacists, because it could be very comprehensive, or it could be just that they're only going to be dispensing the drug. So the clinic is going to be responsible for all the prior authorizations and appeals that might be needed, whereas other pharmacies will kind of take care of all that for you and only reach out to you if there is an issue.
Okay, got it. Thank you. I've got no more questions. If Erica, any other comments related to this? If not, we could probably end the recording.
I've got one more question, and then we can end the recording, and maybe it's something that, because it's kind of new, Sophia, you may not have a lot of, this may be something that we have to kind of just keep on our radar as a council. Do you have any thoughts on the prior auth process and prior authorization process as it relates to accelerated approval drugs? Have you seen a difference in the prior auth? Is it more onerous, more difficult? Any thoughts on drugs that are approved through the accelerated approval pathway?
Um, for the most part, from what I've seen, is that it is very similar as far as the processes that you go through. I will say oftentimes for those accelerated approval drugs, a prior authorization process might not be in place by the time the drug is approved. So kind of there is usually a lag from the health plan, prescription plan's end. And then with several months, sometimes a year later, they will have these are the criteria. So we have unfortunately run into issues where we've started a therapy right away and initially gotten what we thought was an approval, but once they change the requirements, they deny it. So that's been hard for patients who've started therapy and then now have to go through this hurdle. But overall, as far as the process of submission and appeals, it is pretty similar from my understanding.
That's very helpful. Thank you. I didn't think of that fact that you may actually have access to that treatment before those criteria are put in place and then lose access. So those are all of my questions. So I think we can stop recording.
Thank you.
Okay, I'm
That was
so
so
glad you